Forget everything you think you know about why Donald Trump got elected. It wasn't really about policy. It wasn't really about party loyalty. And it definitely wasn't a simple political accident. What happened in 2016 and again in 2024 was something. For decades, Americans watched the economy shift in ways that didn't make sense to them. Jobs that built entire towns vanished overseas. Wages stayed flat year after year while the cost of housing, healthcare, and groceries kept climbing. People Then, into that environment stepped someone who didn't sound like a politician. No carefully rehearsed talking points, no diplomatic softness, no filter. For a huge chunk of the country, that alone was electric. But to really understand the appeal, you have to feel what economic displacement does to a person. Imagine spending your whole life believing that if you worked hard, played by the rules, and stayed loyal to your community, you'd be okay. Then one day, and here's where it gets even more interesting. The support for Trump wasn't just economic, it was deeply identity-driven. Many of his supporters felt culturally sidelined, mocked by late-night hosts, dismissed by universities, lectured by celebrities. This is also where a powerful narrative took shape. The idea that Trump wasn't just running for office, but challenging the people who actually write the rules. For decades, Americans had watched tax laws shift in ways that benefited the wealthiest. Now layer on something most analysts completely underestimated, the role of humiliation. For years, working-class Americans felt that their values, their towns, their religion, and their way of life were treated as embarrassing relics of the past. Out of all this emerged something psychologists call an emotional contract. Most political support is transactional. You vote for a candidate because of their platform, their party, or their record. But Trump's base. Here's the part that surprises people the most. Once a political figure becomes part of someone's identity, attacks on that figure stop feeling political. They start feeling personal. If you insult the leader, you're insulting the supporter. There's also the powerful psychology of belonging. For people who felt isolated in their communities, ignored by their leaders, and unseen by the broader culture, Trump rallies weren't just political events. They were gatherings. Now let's talk about something else. The appeal of certainty in an uncertain time. The 2010s and 2020s have been some of the most psychologically destabilizing decades in modern American life. A financial crisis, a pandemic, media coverage also played a role most people don't think about. Trump was, without question, one of the most covered political figures in modern history. But here's the psychological twist. Even negative attention is attention. Every And then there's the role of nostalgia, one of the most overlooked forces in political psychology. The slogan wasn't just a phrase, it was an emotional time machine. For people who remembered an era when one income could buy a home, let's be clear about something important. Understanding why people voted for Trump is not the same as endorsing or condemning the choice. This isn't about who's right or who's wrong. It's about recognizing that tens of millions of people don't make the same political decisions. So here's the real takeaway. Trump didn't invent the frustration. He didn't invent the distrust. He didn't invent the economic anxiety or the cultural resentment or the sense that the system had stopped working for ordinary people. He channeled all of it.